Hello, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ali Hassan. I'm an international TV presenter and journalist, and I have the great pleasure and privilege to moderate this upcoming session, which is promising to be a very interesting and timely one because we have none other than the European Commissioner for Justice with us, Didier Reynders. Lovely to have you with us.
Pleasure.
Commissioner. We've been talking a lot about democracy in the previous 24 hours, privacy, human rights, values, all these labels that have been going around and been mentioned throughout the sessions here on this stage. But there are some worrisome tendencies. As a matter of fact, the National Endowment for Democracy is saying democratic countries are more susceptible to authoritarian tendencies today than at any other time in the post-Cold War era. Troubling and worrisome is that Europe, which for many years, if not decades, have been a bulwark of democracy, is not exempt from that. Quite on the contrary, we have some countries like Hungary, Poland, Slovenia, even Austria these days, where you are seeing some authoritarian tendencies. As the European Commissioner for Justice, how concerned are you?
But we try to deliver at the EU level about that, and so we try to be sure that it's possible to continue to organize a rule-based system. And if you want to do that, you need to pay attention to the rule of law, to the democratic process, and to the human rights. And of course, we try to do the job at home in the EU, first to protect the EU, but also to be credible outside. And when you spoke about some member states, what we try to do is, first of all, to engage a dialogue with the member states. So for the first time last year, we have published a rule of law report on the 27 member states. And I must say that we have received many positive reactions to improve the situation in the different member states. But sometimes you have a more systemic issue, and you have mentioned some member states. And there we need to use other tools. And in brief, we have, one, the possibility to go to the Court of Justice, the highest court in Europe, to ask to take a decision and to impose some evolutions in different member states, and it's the case, and we have received positive reaction of the Court of Justice in the last months. But if it's not enough, we try also to make a link between the funding on different policies and the protection of the rule of law. If there are some breaches to the rule of law, it's possible to suspend or to stop some funding. To give an example, in the last years, we have seen some attacks against the LGBTIQ community, and so we have suspended some funding, and we continue to do that with a success, because there are some way back in different member states, and we'll continue. And now we have a huge mechanism since the beginning of this year. It's a so-called conditionality. That means that if we have a real breach to the rule of law in one member state, it will be possible to suspend or to stop all the different fundings, not specific fundings, but the MFF and all the recovery and resilience facility. And you have seen, maybe, to conclude on this, in the last days, about the recovery and resilience plan that we have put forward to start the recovery in Europe. We have discussions about that. If it's impossible to see reforms about the independence and the quality of the justice system, or about the fight against corruption, it's possible to don't deliver, to don't fund the recovery and the resilience plan in some member states. And to give example, you have mentioned Poland and Hungary. We are still in discussion now about that, because we have put some country-specific recommendations in our analysis of the budget, in the so-called European semester in Europe, and we make a link. If it's impossible to implement reforms in relation with that, we don't want to fund new developments in those countries.
And you've already mentioned some of the measurements that are in your toolbox, if you will, as European Commissioner. There are some politicians, some European politicians, however, who say after the European Commission has released its latest annual rule and law report that the report is toothless, because at the end of the day, there is an absence of recommendation against violators. There is an absence of actual real-life-based tools that you can take against these countries. I take it you disagree.
Yes, I disagree, because the conclusions of the two first reports in September last year and July this year were very clear. And is the reason why you have seen maybe concrete reforms. In Italy, they are voting now reforms in the justice system on the basis of our conclusions. But to be clearer, we have decided to come next year with real recommendations, very concrete recommendations. It was said by the President of the Commission in a speech before the European Parliament, because it will be maybe simple to say we recommend something, and then the follow-up will be maybe more evident. But again, to don't have any doubts about that, in a very large majority of member states, the report coming from the Commission, it's an important tool to start discussions about reforms. It's a real pressure, because there's a real intention to improve the rule of law. But in some, it's not enough, and we need to use other tools, like I said, the Court of Justice, or the funding, the discussion about the funding. And we have the same discussions with the Council of Europe, or with the World Bank, when we are looking to the candidate countries, because we will ask to the candidate country before the accession to the European Union to fulfill all the criteria about the rule of law, human rights, and democracy, but also with the neighboring countries, and in the dialogue with all the partners, also with Africa. We have started a new partnership with Africa, and I have asked to put the same approach on the rule of law in that, in the partnership.
Interestingly enough, it was only 3 decades, only 30 years ago, that Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History, implying that liberal democracy is going to triumph. He mentioned Europe, of course, as one of those places that will lead the way. Now we have countries, again, without trying to single out anyone, we have countries that are deeply undermining the independent judiciary, that are undermining freedom of press, sexual orientations, all these things on a daily basis in the heart of Europe. You are a very experienced politician. You've been around for a long time. You were a Belgian minister for 20 years. What's the word of your sentiments? Are you surprised, shocked, dismayed, disappointed at the events that have unfolded in the previous years?
Well, sometimes disappointed about the evolution, and certainly the determination to undermine the justice system, to be concrete. But I'm not so surprised, because during many years, we have paid attention in Europe to the budgetary situation, the economic convergence, the social convergence, but not so much about the values. To be concrete, after the accession to the European Union, it was said it's done. You are fulfilling all the political criteria, so it's not the need to verify that. Since some years, maybe from 2016, we have started, I was in the Council at that time, and we have started to discuss about a possible verification of the values and the respect for the values, like we have about the budgetary situation. And we have enhanced the control on the budget since the bank crisis and the sovereign debt crisis 10 years ago. Now maybe with the evolution in some member states to another authoritarian regime, we are paying more attention also to the values, and that is very new. But I said it's not only to pay attention to that in the EU, but it's also to be more credible when we discuss with the others. And we want to have our common standards in Europe, sharing the same values, but we try also to have an influence on the rest of the world. I will just give you some examples. I have just listened to the previous discussions about health. When you try to protect the privacy, to protect the personal data, you need to put into place a regulation. In Europe, it's the GDPR. And we have seen, since some years, 3 years now, after the implementation, that there are privacy laws or same kind of regulations in many parts of the world, not only in California or in South Korea, but also in Kenya. And so more and more, we are moving to a standardization on the basis of the same values with some like-minded partners. The same about the consumers. I'm in charge of the consumer protection. Of course, we need to protect the safety of the product and to give safe products to the consumer. Is the reason why we are engaging with a dialogue with China about that. You know that 70% of the unsafe products in the European market are coming from abroad and not from European companies. But we need also to protect the data of the consumers when they are more and more shopping online, and you know that with the pandemic it's the case. And then we try also to put into place new regulation about the protection of the environment, fight against climate change or protection of biodiversity, or the protection of human rights, in the way to organize the corporate governance in the companies. I will come in the next weeks with a proposal about the sustainable corporate governance. That means the obligation to put into place a due diligence process on the own operations of the company, but also the supply chain, to verify the possible negative impact on the environment, on the human rights. Give an example. We have listened many comments about China in the last days, but we want to fight against forced labor. It's very clear, and we want to ban the introduction of the open market of products with forced labor included. And so that means that when you speak about rule of law, fundamental rights, it's important to deliver at home in the European Union and to take care in different fields of that, to be able to try to have an influence with like-minded partners on the standardization at the global level. And that's very important. The GDPR was a good example. I'm hoping that in the sustainable governance we'll have the same impact like we have had with the Paris Agreement on the climate.
Indeed, and you have mentioned that the credibility of the European Union is very much impotent and at stake for what you are trying to do. How often does it happen when you go around the world and you talk to other ministers, commissioners, and trying to point out their, for lack of the better term, deficiencies in democracy and human rights, and they're telling us, why don't you get your own house in order first? How often does this happen?
No, but first of all, we explained that now we are monitoring the situation in all the member states, but if it's needed, we are taking actions. To be concrete, you spoke about independence of the justice system. I have asked to the Commission to go to the Court of Justice to impose daily financial sanctions against Poland, to be very concrete, concerning the independence of the justice system. But it's not just to talk about that, it's to take concrete actions. And we try to ask to do the same in other parts of Europe, maybe with, I said, the candidate countries or Eastern Partnership, but also in the world. I have had many discussions with the World Bank about that, and we try so to make a link between the funding of different policies and at least the respect for human rights and fundamental rights of the citizens. Of course, we have like-minded partners, and it's maybe easier to discuss with them, but also there we need to have very strong discussions, because just two remarks. First, if we want to be strong, we need to deliver at home, but we need to have more and more a so-called strategic autonomy. We need to be able to manage ourselves in some fields our development. During the pandemic, it was very clear about vaccination. We are the first continent now to provide vaccines in the rest of the world, and we have a real capacity in the vaccination process. But we have had discussions in the last hours about AUKUS and different evolutions in security field. We need to continue to invest in our own security, to be more autonomous, and to be able to have a real discussion in an alliance with some partners on an equal footing. And when we discuss about data protection, to go back to our first issue, of course we have the GDPR, but we want to see if it's possible for the protection to fly over with the data. When you travel with the data to the US, you need to be sure that the protection is traveling too. And now I'm in discussion with our US colleagues about a successor of the so-called Privacy Shield. So it will be possible to organize traveling of data to the US, like we have organized with Japan or with South Korea, with the same protection of the personal data. Of course, there are industrial data. It will be there, in contrary, better to exchange and to open the access for startup researchers and developers. But your personal data is very important. And to be concrete, what I've seen in Europe, in some member states, but also in the world, it's a real conflict between some goals. Sometimes I have listened to the comments saying, of course it's important, the privacy, the protection of personal data, but we have a security issue. So we need to have an access, we need to have a retention of data. Or it's important to have an economic development. So you need to protect the data, but we need to exchange and we need to use. Yes, but if your personal data, you need to protect it. And we have listened just now about health, is the same. You want to be sure that there is a protection of your personal data, but there are many actors asking to have an access. And it's the reason why you have maybe on in your pocket your smartphone. We have organized just before the summer the digital COVID certificate. I was in the Parliament and the Council to have an agreement on a new legislation in 2 months' time. It's very short at the EU level, but with a first condition, a limited number of data. We don't need to know if you are sick or not with another disease. We need to know if you are vaccinated, if you have a test, or if you have a recovery from the disease. No more than that. No information about your blood or about other kind of issues. So that's also very important. And now we are in discussion with many partners to see if it's possible to implement the same system with the same protection.
You mentioned the procedures that the European Union have started against some member states, including Hungary and Poland, of course. Some of these countries, in exchange and return, are, at least on a verbal note, are threatening to leave the European Union. They're saying, listen, if you push us too hard, if you push us to take European law over our national law, there might be consequences. The European Union has already lost Great Britain. How concerned are you, and how delicate is the issue for you as Commissioner for Justice to strike the right balance between ensuring that values, human rights and the rule of law is being guaranteed without expelling or losing other members?
But there are in fact two elements in discussion with some countries. That, the first one. So what's the answer? Of course, it's possible to disagree with the European Commission. It's a political body. So if you put into place a legislation in one member state, we are sure that maybe it's a discrimination or it's a breach to the rule of law, to independence of the justice system, but it's possible to explain no. We are with other goals. But if we disagree, we have the possibility to go to the Court of Justice. And when you have a decision of the Court of Justice, it's become to be a binding decision. And so we try to explain to all those member states that they have signed a treaty with an Article 2 in the treaty explaining the values. And we are sharing the same values. And so we have a Charter for Fundamental Rights, we have different laws, and if at the end it's possible to have a binding decision of the Court of Justice, you need to apply. So that's the first answer. So of course we may disagree, but not against, like in the US when you have a decision of the Supreme Court, like at the national level. And now we need to push pressure on different member states to maintain such a principle, because there is a risk of spillover effect from one country to another one, maybe from Germany in some case to others. If we are challenging the decision of the Court of Justice, it's our high jurisdiction. If you disagree with European law, you don't need to attack the High Court of Justice. You need to change the law. To give an example, we have many debates about migration. We have put on the table a new migration pact. Change the law, but don't attack the authority of the Court of Justice. And the other comments that I've listened in many discussions with some member states is, yes, but we are elected. So they are explaining that democracy is the only one answer. And if you are elected, you form a government, and so you may change the rules. No, there are some limits. That's the rule of law. And I'm coming from a country where sometimes it's very difficult to form a government. It's not the only one now. There are others in Europe. But also, if you are able to form a government with only one party, there are some limits in your possible actions. And the limits are in your own constitution, but also in the EU treaties, and maybe in international rules. In relation with what? Again, rule of law, democracy, and fundamental rights. And we don't ask to have the same system everywhere. You know that we have 27 different electoral systems. It's very difficult to understand the system in my country, in your country too, but we will have the only one presidential election in France next year, the real presidential election. So we have different systems, but we are quite sure that they are democratic. And it's the same for the justice system, for other kinds of elements. We ask not to be similar, so I fully understand the comments about the different culture, different history, but we need to be in compliance with the values, and that's the main issue. And if we are doing that at home, again, it's possible to discuss with other partners and to try to form a group of partners at the international level to go in the same direction. Of course, it's easier with some than with others, and I want to repeat that with many difficulties that we have had maybe with the US in the last weeks and months, we are allies, we are like-minded, we are sharing the same values, that we try to convince them to work together at the international level. It's maybe more difficult with some others.
And the development that we are seeing on a global scale, namely that democratic countries are more and more susceptible to authoritarian tendencies. Take the US storming of the Capitol in America. You had a presidential you had a president, rather, who didn't acknowledge the results of the election. I mean, these are setting bad examples, of course, for the rest of the world. So it's becoming probably more difficult to set the example and to insist on democratic values and human rights all across the globe with examples like these, no?
Of course, it's the reason why the new president, Joe Biden, decided to try to organize a summit about democracy due to the events in Capitol Hill. But it's not only the challenge for the internal democracy in one country. It's also the fact that it was combined with bilateral actions and no more multilateral actions. And if I'm looking to the difference between the previous administration and the new one, we have seen in the last days that there are some common approach on some specific issues in the world. But the main difference is maybe a real new willingness to take part in multilateral discussions. We will see, we will verify, of course, if it's the reality. But to be able again to take part in multilateral discussions with a real capacity to defend our positions as Europeans, we need to be strong in Europe. Again, about democracy, human rights, fundamental rights, but we need also to build more and more our own strategic autonomy. That doesn't mean that we want to be against others, but we want to be sure that we are discussing on an equal footing with different partners. And it's the case in health policy. You know that I've seen that in the Commission, we didn't have any competence in health system. It's not a real competence at the EU level, it's a national competence. But we have built a new policy day after day due to the pandemic. And now there is a common agreement in the member states that we need to have a European policy in health. I'm hoping that it will be the same about security and defense, about the control of the external borders, and about different kind of issues. If we are not doing that, we'll have more turbulences in the EU, and we will lose our credibility in the discussions with the others. So it's not against other partners, but we need to have an autonomic, strategic autonomy in the EU, and we need to deliver, to do the job at home. I try to do that about democracy, human rights, and also in the electoral debates in many member states, it's important to pay attention to the declarations and to try to repeat that we need to work together with some principles. And I said the principles are the primacy of the EU law when the European Union is competent, but also the fact that if you have a high jurisdiction like the European Court of Justice, you need to apply the binding decisions of such a Court of Justice, like the highest court in a country, at the national level.
And with 27 member states as the EU Commissioner for Justice, it cannot be easy by any stretch of the imagination. I can imagine getting everyone on board. As a matter of fact, if we look around the world, if we put on some global glasses and look beyond, you see different alternative models throughout the world. As a matter of fact, yesterday during dinner, we had President Kagame from Rwanda. Some might argue it's an imperfect democracy, but it's a functional system. You have other parts of the world where you have the same. Is democracy the be and end all it used to be, at least on paper, or is that a slippery slope if we say, well, look, there's an argument to be made, democracy versus efficiency. Sometimes in order to be efficient, to get things done, maybe you have to compromise on some democratic elements. Well, what is your take?
My first priority is, I will say, the rule of law. So the fact that we want to work with a rule-based system and to be sure that there are some rules. Of course, we promote democracy, it's clear. But we promote more than democracy, maybe human rights. And it's very important in other kind of system that we have maybe in the world to be able to discuss with the leaders about the human rights and the protection of the human rights. Because it's not due to the fact that you don't have a democratic system that it's possible to organize violations of all the human rights. Of course, it's maybe a tendency if you don't have a democratic system. But I don't want to make a separation, but it's very important to continue to discuss about human rights, dignity of the individuals, also when you discuss with country without a real democratic system. And that's very important at the worldwide level. And I will say, in the last discussions that we have had with the African Union, it was one of the components to say it's not to come with lessons to give. It's maybe to share a common value, the full respect for human beings. And is it possible to say you have different systems? Maybe, but you need to pay attention to that. And just to give a last example, you know that at the European level, but more the EU, we have had the Istanbul Convention. Istanbul Convention to do a lot of things, and I fully understand that it's possible to have a different conception of the family, and we have in Europe different conception of the family. But violence against women or children is a crime. And so if you don't want to ratify the Istanbul Convention, we have said at the EU level, we will organize our own process about the crimes against women and children. And that it's possible to explain also in many countries in the world where they don't have a democracy, but it's not because you don't have a democracy that it's normal to have violences against women or children.
So some elements and some rights are not to be negotiated, you say. They are fixed and ought to be respected and upheld. For the remainder of this session, I want to come to you for some questions. Microphone, I think, is coming your way. We already have the first two questions here in the first row. I would ask you to be brief so we can get the discussion moving along. We only have approximately a little less than 10 minutes, so please be brief. Yes, first question, second question, I'm coming to you. Please introduce yourselves quickly.
Je vais parler français. Bonjour, rebonjour. Merci beaucoup. Je suis vraiment très heureuse d'entendre ce que vous venez de dire. Je crois comme vous que trop longtemps, dans l'Union européenne, dans les négociations avec d'autres pays, mais aussi dans notre travail intérieur, nous avons négligé ce qui fait quand même l'originalité profonde de l'Union européenne par rapport au reste du monde, c'est-à-dire notre ensemble de valeurs et de règles de droit. C'est le seul ensemble politique au monde où la peine de mort est interdite pour y entrer et pour y rester. Donc, il y a évidemment eu des progrès que vous avez soulignés quand nous disposons du levier nécessaire. Par exemple, le grand succès du RGPD, du PDA, appuyé sur la force du marché intérieur, évidemment. Mais lorsque nous n'avons pas ce levier-là, je crois que nous sommes dans un état de fragilité importante. Et nous en parlions hier, je suis très inquiète. Pas seulement de ce qui se passe en Hongrie ou en Pologne, peut-être que Bogdan en parlera tout à l'heure, mais quand je vois ce qui se passe en France, actuellement, en prévision de la future campagne présidentielle l'année prochaine, et que j'entends, que je vois d'abord à longueur de colonne dans de grands journaux de référence, un ancien secrétaire général du Conseil constitutionnel, un des plus grands juristes en France, dire qu'il faut s'affranchir du respect de la Cour de justice européenne et de la Cour européenne des droits de l'homme, je suis alarmée. Et quand je vois, ce qui est pire encore, de grands responsables politiques, y compris quelqu'un avec qui j'étais amie, qui a négocié le Brexit, dont la principale discussion au départ avec les Britanniques, c'était le respect de la Cour de justice européenne. Quand je vois cette même personnalité entrant dans une pré-campagne présidentielle, remettre en cause la suprématie de nos traités, des cours de justice, je suis alarmée. Alors, qu'est-ce que vous pouvez faire contre ça, cher commissaire? Je connais votre détermination, vous avez déjà fait beaucoup, mais voilà. J'espère qu'on n'écrira pas dans les prochaines semaines ou mois Requiem pour l'état de droit dans l'Union européenne.
Alors, je vais garder peut-être la traduction parce que je vais peut-être vous répondre en français. Chère Elisabeth, je dirais que, première chose, j'ai réagi évidemment à un certain nombre des éléments que vous venez d'évoquer parce que c'est inacceptable pour nous de mettre en cause non seulement les valeurs qui fondent l'Union européenne, mais c'est inacceptable de mettre en cause la primauté du droit européen, je le disais, lorsqu'il est évidemment d'application parce que nous sommes compétents dans certaines matières, mais surtout c'est inacceptable de remettre en cause les décisions contraignantes de la Cour de justice, exactement comme les décisions d'une Cour suprême dans un État, y compris en dehors de l'Union. Alors face à cela, qu'est-ce que nous pouvons faire? Nous menons toutes les actions nécessaires, y compris à nouveau des recours devant la Cour de justice avec des sanctions financières, dès que l'on sent un dérapage par rapport à cela. Et les pressions sont utiles. Vous avez rappelé l'interdiction d'application de la peine de mort, c'est vrai aussi au Conseil de l'Europe. C'est ce qui fait qu'aucun pays membre du Conseil de l'Europe, bien au-delà de l'Union européenne, n'a réintroduit cette peine de mort. Seul le Bélarus est en dehors du Conseil de l'Europe à cause essentiellement de la peine de mort. Peut-être maintenant d'autres éléments qui sont venus s'ajouter. Donc ces pressions sont utiles. Alors, il y a évidemment des débats électoraux dans lesquels on doit prendre avec un peu de distance certaines déclarations, mais ça étant, les tendances sont là. Et donc nous devons être beaucoup plus actifs sur la protection d'un certain nombre de principes qui fondent notre union. Et je le répète, c'est ce qui fait que nous avons introduit un certain nombre d'actions maintenant, mais qui se traduisent en bout de course par des sanctions financières. Et je terminerai en disant, parce que je sais que ce sera un des nerfs importants de cette guerre sur l'état de droit, le lien entre le respect de l'état de droit et le financement des politiques est très important. Et nous allons mener de plus en plus ce débat au sein de l'Union européenne, comme nous le menons avec les pays candidats ou avec les pays de partenariat. Et comme je le disais, nous travaillons avec la Banque mondiale de plus en plus pour aller dans cette même direction, d'intégrer l'approche état de droit, respect des valeurs, respect des droits fondamentaux, dans une certaine conditionnalité sur des financements. Et c'est pour ça que j'insistais beaucoup sur les droits fondamentaux, encore plus que sur l'aspect démocratique des régimes. Nous sommes convaincus qu'il faut mettre en avant la démocratie, mais on sait que dans le monde, ce n'est pas partagé unanimement.
So we're almost at the end of the session. I allow for one final question. Please make it a short
please.
one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to underline that I share your opinions, totally. It means that we live in the common space in Europe. We live in the common space of values. And they were, of course, expressed in the Article 2 of the Lisbon Treaty, but they are more in our hearts and in our minds. And for my compatriots in Poland, around between 81 and 86% of our society is in favor of those values, expressing the satisfaction of belonging to the European Union. The European Commission should be a guardian of those values, and I'd like to congratulate you personally, that you do as much as possible, to guard those values. But I would encourage you and the whole Commission to do more, because without the Commission that is a clear guardian and reacts very quickly, on every attempt to assault, on those values, this common space will be divided and will not survive as the European community. So I don't have any question. These are congratulations plus encouragement to do more.
Well, I tell you, this is a perfect way of...
Maybe just one word about that. Thanks for the congratulations, but I want to say that we are trying to do more, because since less than 2 years, we have put into place the so-called rule of law report, so a real report on the 27, but also a new mechanism, the conditionality with the funding of policies and the respect for the rule of law. You know that we are in discussion now about the recovery and resilience plan, because we want to see reforms in the justice system, to be concrete in your country, before to go further with some funding. And why? It's important to explain that just in 2 words. First, a Polish judge is a European judge, like a German one or a French one. It's a European one. So you need to apply the European rules. And the second element, it's a protection for all the individuals and for the internal market. If you need to go to justice, you need to be sure that you have in front of you an independent, qualified, if it's possible, and efficient judge. And if you want to invest in another member state, you need to be sure that if you have a problem with the authorities or with competitors, you will go to an independent justice system. As a reason why the first chapter of our rule of law report, it's about the independence of the justice system. It's a protection of individual rights, but it's a protection of the internal market, what it's one of the most important elements of the union, you know that. And so thanks for the congratulations, but be sure that we'll continue because it's a real protection of the union. Without such a protection of values, we'll have less and less a real union in Europe.
A fascinating, a very timely and important discussion, which we could have, of course, continued for much, much longer, many more, certainly to be continued. That's for certain. Apologies to those whom I could not call upon for more questions, but we're getting the sign to wrap up. Needless to say, aside from the compliments and praise that you're getting, your job is not going to get any easier from here on. I think that's for sure quite a difficult task ahead when democracy is under assault all across the world, but also within Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, the European Commissioner for Justice, Didier Reynders. Please give him a hand. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.